And I welcome back Huw Lloyd for our, what seems to be becoming traditional morning coffee. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too, Anthony.
Very nice to see you. And I'm slowly but surely, as you can see, I'm a bit of a slow learner, but I'm slowly but surely making my way closer to an understanding, I think, in terms of where I want to go and where you're intending someone to arrive at. But is there anything you'd kind of like to clarify or touch upon or revisit at all from our previous chat?
Well,
hey, good to see you, by the way, of course.
Each of our chats, I think we're elaborating somewhat on the prior conversations. And there's only so much you can get into a conversation too. I mean, in a paper, you can condense quite a lot of information, but of course, the whole point of the conversation is to try to unfold and elaborate upon things. So it can quite easily spend just an hour talking about one concept, really, or going over it. I'm quite happy with what we talked about last time. There is a clarification I should make, and that is that although we previously introduced that topic on, we want to talk about the process of these formation of these epistemological forms. By nature of what we're focusing upon, which is activity, the primary focus is on the formation of activity. But hopefully it should be clear that there is a secondary process within that which concerns the epistemological formation or improvement of understandings. And I do actually address or show an instance of that, for example, when I was looking at experimental studies, when I talked about the two activities that were involved in drawing the graphemes, where there was a planning stage and a secondary execution stage. Well, once we get into the planning and showing the coordination between the two, that's demonstrative of the formation of these epistemological forms. So the degree to which the planning actually happens is provided by the child or the agent themselves, and actually agrees with what is undertaken, and perhaps actually is improved as a learning process from the first. There, by doing this, you're showing that process at play.
And just to clarify one thing on my end, when you're talking about planning, you're talking about the planning that the learner is doing, not the planning that you or the teacher was doing to arrange the activity, right?
Right. You want to talk about the child's planning. I mean, to some degree, that might be something that the child takes over from the teacher, because. But even if they do that, that's demonstrative of some appreciations for the guiding schema. Because if the guidance doesn't work at all, that's indicative that they haven't appreciated it, or that they've got some other ideas perhaps. The last session also is quite inevitably, it's quite a low level focus. So I was going into timing details and operations and the movement between operations and actions, and whether they were conscious and unconscious. But that's a necessary point to focus upon, because it's part of the dynamics of learning. Because as these conscious activities get become familiar through these use of signs, and as they become unconscious, that actually frees up awareness to attend to other things. So that has you might be able to reflect upon that in your own learning activity, in senses. Once you become familiar with certain things, you've got a certain amount of resources to available to deal with the kind of complexities that are emerging. So by nature of when people are undertaking something unfamiliar, there's quite a bit of complexity in terms of just what to pay attention to, how to relate everything. And by gaining the familiarity, this process, as you gain the familiarity with it, everything, not only are the operations starting to tease apart, there's a natural process of of structuring going on, especially in something that's manual. There's involved a lot of physical activity, and so there's an uptake in terms of operations and unconscious activity, but also a freeing of the conscious activity to attend to other things. So just as Ozzy's talked about in the example of driving a car, when we're first learning, we can barely even talk to someone else while attending to what we're doing, or we find we have to stop talking in order to attend. But once we're much more fluent with all the requirements for driving a car, we can more confidently have a conversation and know that we can divide our attention appropriately. So
yeah, I use speaking of cars, I use like a gas tank metaphor in my classroom, and I wonder if you could critique this. I kind of just say like our make it simple. I say like there's only so much gas we could fit in our gas tank, which is our brain, and the less gas you need to devote toward, say, like grammar or monitoring your grammar, the more gas you can spend on thinking about how you're making your reader feel, or how you might want to influence your audience, or this choosing this word versus that word, or monitoring the genre you're writing in. The point is that, like, and I've noticed a lot of my students who make a lot of grammatical errors on tests more than they would on regular assignments. My belief is that their gas tank is just pinned to the max. Like, they're running out of gas and they can't attend to that stuff because the demands of everything else are sort of outweigh.
Yeah.
So,
or their attention just isn't on those particular things.
So that's kind of like the crappy argument I make to them when we're doing like some dry grammatical stuff, or stuff that isn't dry. But that you want to, the more you can sort of automate certain processes, the more it frees you up.
Yeah. Well, this might be a starting point for talking about another aspect that I haven't talked much about. It's more high level, and is something that you can perhaps relate to in terms of your classrooms, and relate back to everything else I've talked about, but without needing to worry about the operational details. The operational aspects are still going to be present, but you can think about in terms of planning and design. And that's to think about the activities that you're involved in the classroom, and the opportunities you have in terms of designing the class structure. You can break down that activity into sub-activities, and it's quite natural in a classroom setting. Then you can say to distribute those activities amongst the group. So, for example, if you've got a class, typical classroom size in the UK is like 30 children. So if you had groups of 6 children, right? So you've got 5 groups, and you can set them they can be undertaking some activity whereby now each of those members of the group can have their own specific tasks to be done, right? So one might be focused on grammar, say, another one might be focused upon, I don't know, figurative speech or aspects of it, or just parcel it out in certain ways, and then you can sort of maybe rotate around that. So it's not the same person all the time. You can just rotate around. Now, that's a very quick way in. You could start thinking about how having sub-activities, and through familiarity, they can sort of join together. That's not tapping into the Davydovian stuff or the real developmental stuff. But if you haven't got any time available and you haven't done the design planning, it's a quick way. You could just say, okay, I can quickly divide this up, right? And you can easily, with the kids getting familiar with that format, in subsequent lessons, you can then say, okay, I'm going to be a bit more thoughtful here, and I want that group of children, right, to enter into some problem-oriented activity and to solve things together. And I would suggest that this is actually, there's not, logically speaking, in terms of the structures that I present, there's not a lot of difference between having 6 children, with different perspectives coming together on a particular activity, and just a more sophisticated single person coming to working on that activity, because you're doing the same thing. You're bringing perspectives together, okay, in what's going on. And so when I've been talking, the metaphor that I used, I think it was in the last talk when I was talking about, it was originally Michael Cole's metaphor. He was talking about bringing fragments of a vase together, okay. Then you can think about perspectives as this. You want to bring perspectives together on a larger picture. And the way that this can unfold within an activity setting is talking about sub-activities. So in the example that you've been presenting here, you're saying, okay, they haven't got enough resources to attend to all these different aspects individually. But as a group, each of them could have their own particular role and work together on something. You might have to, you have to think a little bit about how that can pan out in a harmonious fashion. But by having a group attend to it and explicitly rotating the roles in that group. I mean, maybe you don't have, maybe, if one of them is deemed a bit boring or something, if one's just grammar, you can, distribute it differently. So someone's doing punctuation and they're doing, I don't know, some aspects of figurative speech at the same time. And someone else is doing a different aspect of grammar and what have you. If you're, and they're working on some text or some task. Now I had ideas for you also about how to go further and take this much more into the Davydovian sense, and I can launch directly into that, or if you've got some other examples you want to talk about first.
I think it would be best for you to continue, because then that'll give us maybe a little more vocabulary that we can use.
All right.
During the
So
second half of this. Yeah.
Okay, so when in the example I gave with Davydow was a basic mathematics class, and he wanted to bring in a foundational concept, which was quantity. And and he's looking at this quantity, you can think about the kind of perspectives that are required in doing these kinds of comparisons about height and width of things. Okay, you might say, well, you need to be able to perceive a certain part of an object, you get a perspective or a view on that and some other object, and be able to bring them together, and a comparison, and then an idea about which one's bigger or not. But now when you've got comparison of two things that you can't bring together, the idea is you want to introduce some intermediary form of comparison, whatever that might be, pencil or something, some form of measurement. And you've got some perspectives on that. You've got some perspectives on what you're measuring here. And then you've got some perspectives about the relationship here and the relationship here. Okay, so you can see just in the same way that you have, you could be talking about looking at a piece of text and looking at and taking different perspectives on that text in terms of punctuation, whether your verbs and nouns are in the right order, aspects of figurative speech, all these things. You can have different people assuming the roles of looking at those, okay, and bringing them together. The same was required in terms, you could say, in same regard as a group approaching a Davydovian problem. You could say, oh, well, I can see this part and someone else is looking at that. And I mean, it might not happen in the same formal way of splitting up the groups, but in terms of a group attacking the problem, you probably find that different children will start to see or think about different things, and slowly they might work together in order to solve this issue. So Davydow was talking about this issue of quantity. Now in your classrooms, I would imagine that you might have certain concepts that come up. Okay, now the concept that I was thinking of, that, I mean, you can confirm whether you have something like this, would be, for example, the concept of register. Okay, so the degree of formality in text that is written. Okay, now in the same way that Davydow was saying, you want to go back in terms of his history and look at what was the historical problem that brought about quantity, or what kind of situation would bring that about. In the same way, you can look at, like, for example, the concept of register and say, well, when did register first arise within literature? Okay. There's a little bit of confusion we need to clarify, but you're going to have this for many cases. You want to think about, am I talking about register in literature, or am I talking about register as actually used implicitly by people?
Mhm.
Because, you know, a child talking to a teacher and they're talking to a parent or to their colleagues, they're probably implicitly using register. And I would suggest that in the terms of the literature class, if you're focused on literature, you want to look at the history of the use and of the concept of register within literature. Okay. And the little bit of searching around that I did as a prelude to this preparation, I was quite surprised because apparently I didn't do much searching, but it seemed to me that formally this concept was recognized as something like 1950. Whereas I'd have thought formally it would have been recognized, you know, along with a lot of the classics in literature that go back a couple of centuries, right?
Yeah.
But nevertheless, even if you could take that as a starting point, say, well, what was the problem that was trying to be addressed when this concept was first formulated or formalized? Okay, and can I set up a situation, and if my class is not yet familiar with this, so if it's the beginning of the year, class isn't really used to this, and their writing maybe is in a sense of they use the same register right the way through, and a character in their story doesn't actually change tone depending on who they're talking to. And you'll say, so what kind of interesting situation can you set up for those children so they can discover register for themselves in writing? Okay. And I think you can do that. And by doing that, you would really help you're not only are they children getting understanding of register, assuming you'd use that in your classes, but they're starting to put out feelers for themselves in terms of their appreciation for literature and language. If they could, and they get the sense of they've invented this for themselves to a certain degree. It's a personal invention, not a historical invention, but if they've basically helped to invent, then they get real confidence. They can start to read literature in a different way. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
could,
As opposed to just giving somebody a top-down definition.
right.
Actually
Yeah.
have the experience of messing around with the idea and then maybe slapping a label on it later.
Absolutely.
Like I've seen, and I've done this myself. Maybe have a short exchange between two speakers, and then write the same message, the same content, but keep changing the speakers. So rotate the speakers, changing the same content, and you'll notice how they adjust their speech, not only for their own personality, but also for their audience. So
and it's a very interesting.
And it's fun. It's fun. It's goofy.
It's fun
it's
and
silly.
interesting. I mean, I was even the little thinking that I put into this, I was sort of becoming aware of saying, well, yes, if we look at the history of letter writing, for example, letter writing would have been very, very formal. You know, even between, you know, if someone's sending someone a love letter, it's mostly probably going to be very formal if you're going back a couple of centuries and the kind of writing involved. And you can compare that with the content that people have in emails, for example, now, where you can have different registers at play. You know, you can have very chatty emails if it's between people that have a degree of understanding. But nevertheless, even in emails, I would suggest it's more formal than face-to-face conversations, because there's still the hazard of miscommunication, and you know, people can take things the wrong way and things. So
and incidentally, one interesting like modern development is like if you're teaching a live class or having a live chat like now, and you use the chat box, you're going to be more likely to speak informally and quickly because time is of the essence. Sorry, I have this little gnat or something, and I've noticed that that's spilling over into email communication from my students, and sometimes even from me to them. It's because it's just our natural way of type talking in class is just informal chat. So it's just a little observation that's kind of new.
So
that's emerging, I think, right now. The
well, there's a different media,
informality of emails.
So hopefully I've made the point. I'll just go over it again in terms of when I'm talking about development, it's the epistemological development. This is a crux, but it's also the bringing together of certain perspectives. Okay, and I go into this a great deal particularly in the theoretical part of the paper. But now, hopefully, now we can change of emphasis. I think the idea was that you were going to talk more about your classroom settings, and we can perhaps look at how these ideas can
yeah, I think so. I think, and this is going to be
unfold.
very interesting for me because well, a couple things. Yeah, so what I did was I didn't want to take any like major highlights because I'm hoping that talking with you about some of my stuff can improve my stuff, and or at least you can offer me a perspective that is not obvious or in the front of my mind because I'm caught up in my own
Sure.
thoughts and my own timelines and whatnot. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe we can apply some of your expertise to either critique some of the ideas or maybe give me maybe an inside look at possibly what a student might be thinking or experiencing while interacting with this stuff. But what I did is I just took stuff that's recent from my class. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to skew it and like, put my best stuff out there. This is kind of a sequence that moves from the beginning to the end of one unit of study. And so there's something that I use called a digital notebook. And basically this is rooted in my understanding of the concept that word meaning develops. And so basically every marking period, there's one concept that's the focus of our attention. I'm going to kind of talk over this, so don't worry about reading it.
Okay.
But basically, over the course of one unit, students should try to develop their understanding of one concept as richly as they can, with my help and also independently. So this comes from there's like a lesson that introduces this, and I'll try to summarize it with one graphic. Okay, so I put the word chair on the board, CHAIR, and we talk about to what extent do we know that word, and everybody's like, it's the thing you could sit on, and then I'll invite them to go sit on it, and they're like, I can't sit on it, it's just a word, and then we're like, okay, well, what's going on here? Is this actually a chair, or is this like a sign of some sort? Or is it just an indicator of whatever chair is? And then through a series of questions and answers, most people go from feeling like they have 100% understanding of the word to like somewhere like a 15% understanding of the word.
Oh, okay.
Because I'll ask them what they know about the history of chairs, or like 16th century Italian chair culture, or how they're built, or how they're taken apart. Has anybody designed a chair or shopped for chairs or been a chair, like say of like a math department, or etc. So we play around with the word and try to recognize that it has a lot of flavor. And if somebody were to understand everything represented by that word, they'd have like a very rich understanding. So this visual on the screen is it's just like the result of that lesson. Like there are all sorts of ways that we can build up our understanding of the word chair, or maybe a more important word like love, or analysis, or persuasion, or whatever it might be. Okay, so I feel like I'm talking a lot. If you want to ask or suggest anything, feel free.
Well,
otherwise,
so it seems to me that your focus on word meaning and the history is, it's an interesting one to take. It seems you're sort of touching on philosophy, or the philosophical aspects of word meanings too. whether you could structure that in such a way so that the children are the active participants would be interesting. The challenge is to design something so that it becomes a focal point rather than diffuse. So as you're achieving that presently you're achieving that by controlling things and saying that we're focused on these different aspects, but it's whether you can think up an activity in which children would work at this activity, try to resolve things, and in the process it would become apparent to them that there are these different flavors and meanings, and so whether you can, particularly I would think that particularly if you start getting into the history of the use of chair, then many of these connotations will become manifest in that process. And of course, that's where the richness is. Rather than, although you're talking about them, it's sufficient for them it's sufficient for them to acknowledge that actually there are things about this meaning of the chair that they don't know, and so that their confidence, or not necessarily confidence, but their appreciation of how much they know is actually changed through this process. So it's you're being effective in that regard, but I would suggest that they're not really working so much upon their nuances of appreciation, which they would get if they were directly involved in this problem in a Davydovian sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I imagine that once if you can crack a good design for coming up at just particular word meanings, then you would succeed. You might be able to get up with quite a framework in which you could introduce many. So whether you can actually start to go back to when was chair first used in literature, for example. In this sense, you might be getting into the etymology of chair. Okay, so you're basically, you could say, okay, kids, we're all gonna be etymologists for the day, or for this lesson, right? And we're going to put on our etymology hats and dig into the history of words, where they come from. And maybe that would, rather than just involve, getting a big etymology tome or whatever, or using the computer, using the online to just look up the meanings, maybe you could have conversations within the class itself about what's the arguing for the case for particular things, because there's ambiguity there, and you can just even having a discussion in the classroom about the origins and potential meanings of words. Like at whatever level of sophistication you think is appropriate. You start off, why is rabbit spelt with 2 B's and habit spelt with 1, but have the same meaning? These sorts of things. From the empirical way of looking at things, these are enigmas. They're just saying, oh, that's just the way it is. But when you start looking at all the idiosyncrasies of language, although especially in English, where it's like, there's so many of them because they've inherited from so many different languages, and that the idiosyncrasies actually point towards a very complex, interconnected past. But you, especially, if you're looking at, this, it doesn't have to be a dry exercise, because you can look into, for example, the take poetry, for example, and the differences that, or even just literature, the differences that, for example, using similar word meanings, or similar words with similar apparently similar meanings, but from different roots. So you could use, like, the difference between using, for example, Saxon words versus French and other other different words, where the Saxon words might be quite short and quite lots of consonants in them, quite, and quite gruff.
Mm.
And the French introduction may be more sophisticated, and so you could have lots of conversations about that. And it just sort of, so to take on and say, it's like to try and make it as real as you can.
Mm.
It's not like saying, okay, like I see some reports about, people are saying, okay, we want the kids to sort of be working it on science and things like that. So they have to put on their white science lab coats and, and play around with test tubes. And they haven't really put much thought into the actual content necessarily. It's more like we're going to have a drama class rather than actually do real science.
Right.
The same way with the if you're going to say, right, we're going to be etymologists for the next hour or so, then actually do it.
Yeah.
Don't pretend to do it, and just pose the questions and give the guidance where required, but get the kids really into it, because to start with, it might not even know that there is such a thing called etymology, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's helpful feedback. One of the things with this chair lesson is students who seem to kind of get it and grok it and take to it right away are often running almost for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
And they're called digital notebooks, where it's basically like, I call it like, here's your playground to develop your understanding of this word. Currently, the word is analysis, and they are eager often, although it's work, and quite capable of really taking it on independently and doing things that are surprising to me, surprising to themselves, like really interesting, fun to read.
Yeah.
And then there are students who, right from the start, they don't get the first lesson, and then their notebooks are pretty much, they stay kind of empty, except for, like, they're allowed to copy and paste activities from the unit that I introduced. I want them to, I want their notebooks to be roughly half of my stuff and then half of their own investigation. And that other half often doesn't happen. And so it's really hard for me to,
so maybe
even still, it's hard for me to reach them and connect this to them and offer them like the scaffolding or whatever that they might need.
So what the impression I would have from what you said is that you perhaps, if you spent more time at the beginning stage in terms of just this, because some kids are just going to be quite intuitive and they're kind of philosophically minded, and are going to be able to relate. So they might not even know what philosophy means, right? And so we'll be able to explain it or give a definition, but they have this kind of way of thinking about things, right? And they can relate the philosophy to the use of the language. And other kids will be just looking at it in terms of saying, well, this is where I'm supposed to do English or language, and I do languagey things, and in a different class I do mathsy things and science things, and what's going on here? Okay, so but if you spent time getting the kids involved in actually trying to work out for themselves what this is, what word meaning is, right?
Yeah.
Philosophy. You might feel for you that saying, oh, we haven't got much to show for this yet, because all we've spent doing is all this conversation at the beginning, or this trying to grapple with this problem. And some of the kids have just got it straight away, and other kids aren't, haven't really touched it fully yet, but given the opportunity for them to do so. But you also can use especially if you're doing things in groups, right? You can make use of the pupils that seem to have got this quickly, can take on certain leading roles within the groups and help in certain ways. All right. You want to think of like the group itself as an individual to a certain degree, and just see if the group gets it, right? And then you just got to make sure, you got to worry about that it's not just one person or two people doing all the work, but that You know,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, part of this also is just the emphasis on, this is why I was saying in a developmental environment, a developmental schooling environment, you want the kids on board too, because you can't just be, just a passenger, you know, and all you have to do is just sit through the exercise. You want the positive engagement with it. But I would suggest, I mean, something, particularly language use, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you should get this. The other thing, of course, is that you don't, if you have, for example, children from different ethnicities, then you have a huge available resource to you in terms of looking at the kinds of informal languages, all right, or ways of speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in terms of, you know, whether it's African influence or Latin influence, or all sorts of different ways of speaking, or depend. So it's just tapping into the richness that is available to all the children in terms of, you know, their backgrounds,
Mm-hmm.
that you can help them relate to what they're doing. And then hopefully you get more light bulbs flashing, and you get
Mm-hmm.
more excitement. And once you've got some excitement going, you know, you should be off. And then it's just a matter of keeping up with them at that point,
Right.
keeping them sufficiently disciplined, and say, okay, you know, next stages.
Yeah, no, that's great and helpful.
Some of these things, it's just like turning things inside out to a certain degree. The easy way is to talk about like your schema you had and say, this is how I'm doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, you know, some classes you're gonna, that's just the way you're going to end up with things, because you've got if you've got discipline issues, then you might have to do things that way. But
Yes.
if you can turn the whole thing inside out so that it's the structure of the activity itself that is providing all the signposts about, you know, what needs to be done, then good things can come from that as well.
Yeah, I'm going to show you another thing that I think, I don't know, maybe it's a bit too teacher-centric. But so my students have a test coming up. It's kind of, so this is like a mini 2-day unit within a bigger unit, and designed to help them do well on the test. So I asked them to attend to certain literary concepts, and looking at all of these things at once can be a bit overwhelming. But I wanted to show them that they can do it, and also that this is the type of thinking that will pay off on their test. So instead of giving them like easy poems that are meant for middle school, I start with like a challenging text, a couple challenging texts. And I'm just going to put one up real quick. And so this is a poem. It's a song, actually, but I think it's really quite beautiful and very impressionistic, and leaves a lot of room for interpretation. So I asked them to read it a couple times, specifically just looking at one or two things at a time, like imagery, or I give them a tool to analyze character, and I give them a tool to analyze setting. So I'll ask them to just focus on one of those three things: imagery, character, or setting. To slowly start developing an understanding. Then I'll ask them to do just a bit of writing in our chat, which is, everything's done online right now. Just sort of just recording what they've noticed, and then I'll put them into small groups to discuss and start building some interpretations of one question. So they'll pick one of these three questions. Oops. They'll pick one of these three questions for chat, just verbal discussion. And then when I call them back, sorry for bearing with me. I transcribed all the lyrics onto the video. The video is really cool too.
In a vase, a slipper by the fireplace, a yellow light in its case.
Okay, So that
Nice.
gives a nice, that gives like a nice layer to it. And at that point, they're a little more invested maybe in the poem on an emotional level too. And it gives them, I guess, maybe some clues or cues how they might interpret it. I'm almost done. And then I'll ask them to write long, like try to write like 100 to 200 words on one of these questions. And then we'll go through a series of other poems and or like short videos. This one's a animated short, and kind of just repeating the same stuff over and over again, but adding in different layers each time so that they could maybe see many things at once and formulate a more of a coherent interpretation of the poetry. That at first was a little bit difficult for them. And then before leaving, they have to write like publicly, like a response to one of the questions. And most of them, maybe not surprisingly, most of them picked the poem that I just showed you, which might have been one of the more difficult ones, but I'm not exactly sure why. And I don't know. So that's it. So that's just like one little sequence designed to prepare them for a test. So I don't know. What do you think of that?
Well, it sounds like a lovely exercise to do. Again, the kind of input I would have here is about your structuring of that. So you've got a wealth of good material here. It's about what could you do to enable the kids to do this for themselves, right? It's like saying, what kind of task do I need to set that's just going to draw them in, all right? And also, this fits in almost perfectly with what I was saying before about having groups, because I think you had about 6 or 7 skills listed, one of which was characterization and setting, another imagery, and you had some others. And you, with some upfront work about what is required for each of these individual things, you could have your group of 6 right from the start, okay? And if you knew if you were going to do something like a problem situation, right, or task situation, something that's going to draw them in, so they have their separate roles to do, okay, in terms of identifying these things. But also, I would suggest you then got a very interesting activity of, once you've got your 6 or so people, I've only got 5 here, but never mind. Once they're doing their own activity, their own skill bit, but then you want to start to look at the interaction between these, because they're not separate aspects, right?
Yeah.
How does imagery affect characterization, and how does the setting influence it? So you're going to have maybe something like register, but not register, but something like register as your point of interaction between character and setting, because your character could be different depending upon the setting that they're in. If they're attending a job interview, it's more formal, and if they're all these things. But and then to get involved, so again, if you can get the activity itself entailing these individual efforts, but also entailing the interaction, the communication between them, each other, and then rotating who does what at different times, and getting them involved in this. I mean, maybe, I don't know, getting towards the end of term, and sometimes, I don't know if it's the case in your school, but sometimes the last few days of school, it's sort of almost, you've got some free time available, and you can do something more experimental, and you might have time just to launch into something like this, just to see how it goes. But preparation is required in terms of getting the activity structure lined up. So you could just say, what is this poem all about? And look at this poem. That would take them so far, but you might be able to get beyond that, or think about ways of framing it. What is poetry all about in the first place? And why the more you get into that sort of philosophical part of what we're trying to do with poetry, and again, depending on your ethnicity and interest of your kids, it might be more, I don't know, it could be rap or something that you're, rather than a song that you're drawing upon, or things. But so what are you trying to bring out? What are the different layers and contributions towards it? So there's you could say that maybe they're trying to get, this whole thing is trying to give a certain impression. You see, using all these different techniques to generate an impression. And a lot of kids are, they're very interested in giving impressions and making the right impression, right? So if you can frame it that way, as saying, first of all, you could say in their own activity, look at something saying, how do you write to something to give a certain impression? And then look at something like this poem that you're looking, or the song that you're looking at, saying, what impression does it give you? And now, why does it give you that impression? What's going on? How do they achieve that? And if people, maybe if you've got a group of 30 kids, and you're going to get some agreement perhaps about what kind of impression you get from it. And they say, and there might be divergence, but you've immediately got the starting point saying, how did that arise? What did their children pick up on? Yeah. And then you can start to look at saying, well, if there's alliteration, for example, or, various, as I was talking before, figurative speech in various different ways, some things can be very powerful, I think of things like the Ancient Mariner and things like that, the kind of language that can go into that. And if you have phrases like, all hands on deck, and you think about, once you look in the language, why are they saying a hand? Why have all hands on deck? Does that have some, is that more emotive than just saying everybody up on deck? Why all hands on? Why is it something like, the hands are really required? Is it just, all the hands of the crew that are required? And these sorts of things, if you can start to question everything.
Yeah,
that's the questioning, the questioning of the kids themselves, rather than yourself. You can sort of maybe set things up, but the more the kids are sort of asking, well, why? How is this effect achieved? Yeah, and taking on the use of language for themselves and saying, oh, okay, I am a user of this language. I can do things with it.
Yeah, setting up, and one of the themes that I'm picking up is just setting up inquiries whenever you can.
Yep.
I just wanted to show you very briefly that, so this was the actual test that follows up some of those practice exercises I was showing you, where students will have a choice of 5 texts to write about analytically, but in a fun way. So where they basically have to go enroll and become a character from the text, and write out an application for either a job or for like a private school. Those are like relevant tasks to the students in my school. Those are things they might be doing. And so this is a thing called enroll writing, where you basically become, you adopt a persona, either like a character or like an author, or even maybe a concept or item from a text, and write from its perspective.
Great. Yeah.
So, and that's been like a really nice bridge to analytical thinking. That's very accessible to most people, and also kind of fun. So the end of the unit is a straight like literary analysis essay, that, like with a more formal register and everything that goes with that. So that's cognitively pretty demanding. But this is sort of like a midpoint test that's still building a lot of the skills that are going to be necessary to have internalized mostly, so that you can actually write the essay at the end. And this is just one other thing I wanted to show you. Like, we're working with a novel called The Pearl by John Steinbeck. And this activity is an extension of the in-roll writing concepts. And so I know there's a lot of text, but you don't have to read it. And what you have to do here is create sort of like a mentor figure, create maybe sort of like a spiritual guide of some sort for the main character, or for the other main character, which is Kino's wife. And basically insert, like, maybe you call them ghost chapters, like insert a additional scene into each chapter, which is a conversation, between the protagonist and his or her guide, who we call the visitor. And so these are things that might take place in the character's dreams, or maybe in like some space between dream and reality, maybe just in like a waking daydream. And essentially the visitor has to be very wise, has to be like very knowledgeable, and more than I am, and more than the student is, and more than the character is. So you have to sort of role play as somebody who's capable of giving this worldly counsel. Okay, so, and then there's a couple other things I want to just say quickly. We lost from our curriculum, we lost some narrative writing, and I was a little bit disappointed with that. So this was a way to bring narrative writing and creative writing back into the curriculum, because students have to write and punctuate their dialogue, and use imagery and use all sorts of narrative skills. And also, this is a way to reinforce a concept that you and I talked about last time, and just going to show you real quick. Thanks for your patience.
It's fine.
And so here's a concept from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and Highly Effective Teens book. And we were talking about emotions last time. And this is the idea that no matter what happens, if you can create a little space before you respond, that gives us room. That gives us room for choosing, like maybe gives us the freedom to respond in a way that's maybe advantageous. So one year my students were reading that for their summer reading book, and that they read the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens. And that school year, maybe I'm biased, that school year went like extremely well, and I thought the book had a really powerful impact for them.
Great.
And then that book disappeared. But I try to keep some of the concepts alive, and this is one of them. This idea of reflecting and trying to choose your response whenever possible. So this visitor assignment is a very long and it's somewhat arduous, like extension of that idea, combined with the literature that we were already reading, and then also using like the in-roll writing technique that students like. Okay, so I talked for a while there. Do you have any thoughts on going through your head in response?
Oh, well, yeah, I'd agree with you. That's, I mean, I think that exercise is, you're tapping into a lot of dimensions, not, particularly imagination. I like the way you're relating the Covey material to aspects of wisdom. And, you're inviting the child to think about, their own, themselves and their own activity to a certain degree in taking on this task of interjecting this wise character into a story. You're thinking about forms of guidance. So yeah, great exercise. Good, good material for children to be working with.
It's gonna say, yeah, it's something that they often have fun with. Half the battle is creating the entity that's going to be the guide.
Yeah.
And and also, this is a book where I think traditional readings of this book focus on the fact that the protagonist is considered too greedy, and his greed foils him in the end. And
all right, yeah.
And I think that's okay, but there's a lot more going on. And
all right,
and
so
that also the protagonist is part of a victim class, that he's part of an oppressed people.
Okay, all right,
and which is true in many respects, but I don't see how that's empowering to read the book through that lens, as opposed to reading the book through, okay, Kino, the main character, has a series of decisions and micro decisions to make, like in every single scene. And had he played his cards slightly differently, maybe things could have worked out differently, in spite of his like oppressed class, and in spite of his, in spite of all these like troubles that are sort of baked in societally. And so that's all true, and that's part of our reading. But I like to offer the complementary lens that every individual still has this opportunity endlessly to try to make decisions as best he or she can, and with constant reflection and emphasis on maybe creating a little bit of space before responding. Even the very disadvantaged, and every human is disadvantaged in one way or another, can increase his or her odds, I guess, of ending up where they want to go. Right. So, and then the other last thing is that I tell them, like kind of half jokingly, but somewhat seriously, I'm like, when you finish the book, like, you're going to put the book down, but the visitor is going to stay with you. Because the visitor is you, and something silly like that.
Well, wonderful exercise that the kids can enjoy doing. I think it's one of these exercises where it seems to be, the emphasis is more upon life and the role of literature and all their language skills, which ostensibly is what they should be practicing, are sort of withdrawing into the background to a certain degree. You want to say that, and I think this is natural. Whenever if you want to write, in order to write well on something, you need more than just the desire to write. It's something needs to be communicated, and if you don't have that thing that you want to communicate, then the writing is just going to be more superfluous. It's not achieving what the aim. And so I think it's this is why in literature and language, you need these big ideas, because these are well, first of all, it's nice to be able to introduce them into school in some form or other, and if not in literature and language, then what? But also it's a natural part of our language to go into these other areas, including myth and wisdom and these various dimensions of our life. Whether, as you were saying, that perhaps some children will get more out of the context than others. Whether some people would identify with a sort of and slightly oppressive circumstances that are challenging, and others would maybe look at it and think, oh well, you know, I don't quite like that, or I you know. So whether you could arrange things so that the children can have more control over that, perhaps, and say this is the way the story's going, without you know, just loading them with so much more work to do. If they've got to, you know, rewrite their own novel effectively or something, or you know,
Yeah.
then also I suppose there's things you could look at. I mean, if they are basically slotting in sections, then it's hard to see if this wisdom is so important and influential, right? Then why isn't it having a consequence further down the line? Do you see? Why? Or is it just being ignored? You know, so you've got this wise person coming in, but
Yeah, it's usually being ignored.
okay, but you see, if it's going to have impact, or so that's another to bring. Even I would suggest that even in fairy tales and myth and other forms, which, you know, you could say is make believe. When you have these influences, like of degrees of wisdom or some moral coming in to play, that's, to some extent, you might say, that's where there's a connection with reality in terms of the, you know, the moral of the story or things to be careful of. And it might be nice to see, especially from the children's perspective, if they're right, if this wisdom actually has a bearing, then you want to say, oh well, things might happen as a consequence. Now, let's say, for example, supposing do you teach? I mean, if you, for example, taught across two classes, for example, you taught a higher age group and a younger age. I don't know if you do that sort of thing, but you know, just throwing some ideas out. For example, you could have a story that unfolds. You know, the children are writing one. They write, this is the wisdom that's a given, and something, you know, what happens as a consequence is dependent upon that. Do you see what I mean? So rather than just have this boilerplate, this template of this is exactly what happens, and you are providing this wisdom which doesn't actually influence the story necessarily. Yeah, by weaving that in, then you know, there might be, I don't know whether they might still, especially if it's, I don't know how long the project is, but if you had something going on over time, you might think, you know, they're starting to see the consequences of that. Like, for example, does this wise person just lay it all on the table and say, this is what it's all about? Or have they got to be more cautious and say, you know, deal with, you know, they've got this tearaway who doesn't even hardly wants to pay any attention, and they just say, well, I'll just give you a few little things that you might pay attention to, and maybe you know. So, but yeah, there could be, I mean, for example, you could have, you know, if you had different age children, and you could have your senior kids, you know, writing follow-up chapters or something, and I don't know, it's just an idea. I just think it's just sort of how to get into that. I mean, you know, it's nice what you have, but you just think when you're presenting it and you want to give some, you know, ideas back, it's like, well, how can we improve that?
Right.
So,
yeah, and
then you've got the whole activity side to it as well, in terms of, again, you know, I mean, this is what the children expect of you anyway, in terms of you give the tasks, you give the breakdown, you say how it's going to be marked, etc., and then they go do it. I mean, they're going to expect that. But if you want to get into the more developmental stuff, then the more that you can allow the activity itself to express, then the better. And again, that's part of, because the reason when you have a like I keep focusing on these problem-oriented situations, but when you have these active task activities, all the artificiality is going to fall away, because everything becomes streamlined or related to each other in terms of how things fit together. We give a metaphor of, for example, how an airplane is built. All right. If you had different people building different parts of the airplane, or you just said, okay, I need wings, and you have to do something vaguely wing-like, you just have this big rectangle, thin rectangle sticking out. The thing wouldn't fly, or it would fly very awkwardly.
It lacks
But because
coherence.
so you want, there's an interaction between all the parts, okay? But you only get the nuances of this interaction by being involved in the activity and being responsible. That you can, so you're interested in everything about the activity and how it fits together, and whether you get good results or not gives you feedback about whether that thing holds together. But if someone basically is analyzed this sort of situation and said, okay, I want to present this in a simplified manner, and I'm going to say we have all these different aspects you need to pay attention to, and I'm going to make this task and someone has to do it, then you don't have the opportunity to explore the interaction and the nuances to see how it all holds together. Whereas if you take it seriously and say, actually, what I have here are budding linguists or budding literature enthusiasts or poets and what have you, then you want them to be doing poetry and really explore these things and get into and explore that part. So the more you can foreground that and still achieve it within the schooling environment, then the more that you're going to the kids are going to get out of it, and as a teacher, I think get out of it too. But what you've got there is a nice thing to be doing. So I don't want to detract from what you've already got. It's just if you're asking for inputs, then
Yeah, of course. I'm always looking to figure out ways to reframe something, or to maybe turn it more, to add a little more inquiry into it, or to strip artificiality away when possible, and also because this is not a strength of mine, to get inside the heads of the learner. I mean, I have them constantly writing about their own experiences. They do a lot of reflection and whatnot, which helps them and me. But still, just to try to see things through eyes other than my own and my own intention. So everything you're saying today is very helpful and and much appreciated. And I have about probably 5 minutes at the most. Sorry.
Okay. I just had one thought on that. I mean, you could turn that kind of exercise on its head a little bit and say, well, you take a known story and you pull out and look at some wise character, all right? And you could look at that from different angles. Even if it was something like, I don't know whether Star Wars was ever actually written about, there was a books before the film, but someone like Yoda, all this is a different kind of narrative, and whether he would actually have an influence and things like that on the, I mean, I'm sure there's lots more contemporary forms than going back 20 years or whatever it was for Star Wars. So but sorry, so 5 minutes, use it wisely.
Yeah, I would like to open things up to you. So you started today with some clarifications and some not revisions, but just clarifying some things from the last conversation. And then after that, I just shared a couple of things that we're doing in my classroom currently. And I guess having talked about some of this material and then thinking back to our previous chats, is there anything you'd like to say? Sorry, that's not a good question, but.
Well, I think we've got some potential dovetailing going on when I gave the example about use of register and working with groups and trying to design something to say, okay, how can the kids discover this for themselves? Now, I think without too much work, you could come up with, an exploration that the kids are doing in order to discover what register is all about, or the concept of register, and go into that. You can go into looking at taking on roles. So you have your etymology class, for example. I mean, maybe there's more to the word meaning that you were looking into than just etymology, but that's one facet of it. And maybe you're going to have other parts.
Yeah.
Ooh. You've got lots of good reflection work going on. So that's great. I'm wondering whether, see, if you could set something up saying, well, effectively, you could sort of say, well,
just one minute, honey. 1 minute, honey.
You can effectively say to, I don't know, whether you could do this with all kids, but in some respects, I thought you can say to kids, you say, well, look, we're at school. I have to mark you on certain things. All right. And if you want, we can set things up so that I mark you on things that you want to do. If some willingness to do that, and with guidance. And so all of a sudden or I can just give you what you're supposed to be doing. Now, you might argue, you might be having this kind of conversation tacitly with some people anyway, in the sense that if you got some kids who just want to, launch into things and they come up with ideas and you say, yeah, great. Why don't you write about that or what have you? So maybe that's going on, but to a certain degree, if the more deeper you want to get into this developmental aspect and the autonomy and the self-directed aspects of the work that kids do, then the more you need to get into this personal responsibility aspect. So, but that's a good thing in the sense that, especially, whatever your take on this is, whether you want kids to be, come away more reflective or better appreciation for literature, or, even a love for literature coming out of it. There's so many, takeaway things that you can place emphasis upon that fit you in terms of what you're about as a teacher and how you want to contribute and what you want the kids to come away with at the end of the day. So, you could argue that my emphasis on all this problem-oriented stuff is just, it's
about you.
More about me.
Yeah. But it's good stuff. It's good stuff. And I know that for a fact. It's very good stuff. And it's influencing me also. And I'm getting yelled at by my kids right now.
Sure,
as you could probably hear.
But the exercise for you is like saying how to turn. The exercise for you is that if you're interested in doing things this way, you need the skill being able to how to turn things inside out from your generic lesson to a problem-oriented lesson, or a question-oriented lesson. I don't mean problem in the sense that it's something is a problem at hand or is an issue. Just so if you get exercise and being able to turn these, go from one to the other, and say how do you restructure something to achieve that, and you could do that partially by if you take known examples and say, okay, that's what your basic template would look like as a plan. This is what a sort of developmental approach would look like, and you can see how to go between the one and the other's one's already been produced, and you should start to see how you can do the same thing. Now, I suggest I've given you enough for you to be able to do this for something like register or aspects of figurative speech.
Yeah, totally.
But it's going to be a learning process for you as well, in terms of how do you, just getting used to it and confident with it, but you don't have to do it all at once.
When this is these actions require conscious attention early on in the process, but eventually it becomes sort of automated where you can sort of just shift back and forth between the two. I wanted to thank you for this is the first time somebody invited me to answer any questions, and that was a little bit weird and awkward, and it gave me a great appreciation for how you and all the people I interview, how skilled you guys are at talking on the spot with planned topics, but also unanticipated questions. And even today, I shared some work that was that you hadn't seen before, and your responses were extremely helpful and very coherent and useful, and I really appreciate all that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah. I think it's just familiarity, really. You know, there's not putting yourself under undue pressure, and you thinking you could just, you know, just do what's required and enjoy what you're doing. Yeah.
Totally. Keep in touch, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right, I'll contact you soon. All right, thanks again, man.
You're welcome.
Okay, take
All
care.
right then.
Ciao.
Goodbye.
All right. Okay, bye-bye.